While the first 4 strategies were preferences in style on how to play Grand Arena, this strategy is not about you, it's about adapting to your opponent. As a result, it applies to anyone regardless of your roster size. It's historically my most successful strategy that I've been using since before Grand Arena history was a thing. It hasn't been successful because I'm necessarily good at it, it's just that most people are not too difficult to read and don't put too much effort into Grand Arena. The idea of this strategy is to look through your opponent's roster, and since recently their Grand Arena history as well, to then assign probabilities on whether you expect them to use teams on offense or on defense. You can then formulate a strategy that allows you to win no matter what your opponent does. Now this sounds like a lot of work, but once you get the hang of it, it actually only takes about 15 minutes for most opponents. And if you enjoy this kind of challenge, it's also an interesting puzzle in human psychology, and you won't mind occasionally taking longer against a very tough opponent. Now there are many steps to read into what your opponent will likely do, and you will probably need to use most of these to get the full picture. Note that I personally don't go through this process step by step. I've anticipated opponents many times, and many of the steps happen at the same time. However, if you're not used to analyzing your opponents in depth, then I hope that taking it step by step will help you to get familiar with this strategy. So the first step is to look into what kind of player you are facing. A lot of people like to use bots for this to get a comparison of overall numbers. To me, this isn't useful in any way, and I almost never do it, because I only care about how those numbers are spread across their roster. I always do 2 quick checks for my 7 opponents at the start of a Grand Arena week. The first is, do they have a high lifetime score? Now it's not always proof that they are a very capable player, and it's also not always proof if they have a lower score that they aren't a capable player, because maybe for some reason they missed out on a week due to a sign-up bug, or they just didn't have time that week, but it doesn't always say enough about skill. But if someone does have a really high lifetime score, that of course immediately catches my attention. And the second check is to see what speeds they have on their meta characters that are currently defining for the board. So for example, for a very long time this has been Darth Revan, but it could change in the future. Now after that I will check for my specific match how many offensive wins and defensive holds they have. So what's the ratio between those? If this ratio is around 50% like for me, then they tend to go very defense heavy. If it's about 25%, then you know they go very offense heavy. And there is of course a wide spectrum in between. Now after this, you can take a quick look at their Grand Arena history to see if they always set the exact same defense. A surprisingly high number of people still do this, and it can make this a very short exercise, as you just need to keep a counter for everything they set on defense, and then set as much of your teams on defense as possible. And usually this means that you'll end up stronger than them. Now it's tempting to go look through their entire history in depth at this point as your first step, but don't get lost in it before understanding their roster, as you'll just be doing double work, and you want to spend as little time on this as possible. You just want to get a first impression here, and it's entirely possible that your opponent will end up doing something very different from what you see in their history, and you still need to be able to win if that is the case. Now if your opponent doesn't always set the same defense, then you can move along to the next step and inspect their roster. So the second step is to look at which teams your opponent has, and how they have allocated resources across those teams. I make a list of their usable teams, of course I'm not going to include teams that can take out anything on my board, and then I take some notes next to them for anything highly unusual that I shouldn't forget about those teams or the characters. For resource allocation, you first want to look at whether they have relics on unusual characters that could cause trouble for your usual counters. If that is the case, then they likely fall short in gear elsewhere as a result. So focus on fixing your own efficiency there and making sure that you can still counter that team, but look for ways to exploit theirs too. In many matches, this deficiency that they have can be the choke point that you can use in your strategy to beat them. The second thing you want to look at is if they have the full upgrades needed to counter a certain team. Take for example a CLS team. If it has a bunch of relics but not enough to take down a General Skywalker team, then it might overkill most of your other teams that it can beat, and in that case it wouldn't be too surprising to find that CLS team on defense instead, or your opponent might be wasting a lot of power on a much weaker team, and that wouldn't be a good choice for them. That's really the third step we're getting into now, looking at the relic allocation that they have with the context of your roster. And when you know your roster well, this pretty much happens at the same time as looking through their roster. So if your opponent has a weak Geonosian team, for example, while you have a very strong Treya team, then it could potentially be smart for your opponent to set their Geonosians on defense. Sure, it's a free kill for you, but it's also overkill, and the more relic characters you can make your opponent use on a weaker team, the better. If on the other hand your Treya team is evenly matched with their Geonosians, it could be more attractive for the opponent to keep their Geonosians on offense, or to use them to draw out your Treya and set something else behind that also needs her team to counter it. This step also counts for variations of teams. Look at Grievous, for example. Depending on who is the fifth in that team, people like to use very different counters. If your opponent doesn't have a relic Daka, then you know they would struggle more against your Grievous team if you added BB-8, because they wouldn't be able to use their Night Sisters. As a result, your opponent might need to overkill this team, and then they would have to use a counter that they may need for something else. If the match allows it, then also setting that other team, that could be your win condition. Your opponent would then be unable to one-shot or kill all of your teams, and that would give you the opening that you need to overtake them in banners. The fourth step is to look at how your opponent has historically used their teams, the thing you quickly peeked at in the beginning. Now, up until now, you've made assumptions on what your opponent will do, and through their Grand Arena history, you can see the odds of some of these assumptions increase or decrease. By looking more in depth at the history, you can also take note of which teams they failed against, and potentially even check their opponent's gear and modding to get a clue on why this happened and if you can somehow replicate it. If you see any patterns in how they use their teams, like heavy dependence on a certain counter, then you can potentially set your map in such a way that it becomes difficult for them to use this counter. Everything's really on the table to win here. The fifth step is to look at how your opponent did their modding on certain key characters. This is usually relevant for the fastest or the hardest hitting characters, or the ones you need to try to kill first in certain teams. And this is an important step. Just because an opponent used a counter in the past, this doesn't mean that they will win against your potentially better modded team. In the same way, your own counters may fall short if your opponent has certain well-modded characters, and this may force you to change your decisions. Modding can also give away how someone likes to use a certain character, as sometimes you simply need a specific setup to make a certain counter work. As I already mentioned earlier, if someone doesn't have their old Daka Zetad and over like 100k health and 250 speed, then you know they likely won't be trying their Night Sisters against your Grievous team. If they don't have their Chewbacca modded for tenacity, that won't be their counter to General Skywalker. And if their Vader only ends up at around 260 speed after his unique, then chances are low your opponent would set their Empire team on defense, as even Ewoks could just walk over them. And the list goes on. Now the sixth step is to bring it all together and create your defensive map and offensive teams. You quickly write down a few hypothetical maps on paper, in Excel or Google Sheets, and you try to predict how your opponent might try to counter these on offense, and what that would leave them with on defense. If the end result means that they can't one-shot your board, and you can one-shot theirs with limited risk, then that's likely what you'll end up using. It requires some skill and flexibility and modding on your part to use the same team to counter different opposing teams, as your opponent won't always set exactly what you expect them to. It's also possible for you to still lose fights, so you have to be able to adapt to ensure that you can still clear more teams and zones than them, or get a higher efficiency. The seventh step is only applicable to highly skilled opponents that use the same strategy. You need to think about what your opponent would do if they saw your own roster and history. Now it's really easy to get lost in this and overanalyze, and I'm speaking from experience here, but if you have a highly skilled opponent, they will do this analysis too. So think about this situation. If your opponent does the exact same thing quite a lot because it works well, but you see they're a very skilled player and they know that you are too, what are they going to do? Will they continue to do the same thing because they hope that you think that they will change their strategy? Or will they change it up because you are skilled and they may try to anticipate how you would try to beat their usual defense? That's some mind-blowing stuff right there. It's incredibly difficult to anticipate what they will do, so you have to make a decision here without all of the information that you would like to have. Will you go with a certain setup that seems good enough to you and let the other person break their head over trying to anticipate it? Or will you try to prepare for any scenario that they throw at you? there is a large range of potential outcomes depending on what both of the players decide. Now, my only concrete advice if you fight against a serious strategist is to not put yourself into a situation where you're forced to do too many battles that you have never or rarely done. It's tempting to change things up and to do something unexpected to try to catch them off guard, but it shouldn't put you into a position that you cannot handle yourself. So really know what you're capable of doing and don't try to mess yourself up there. Now, these are the 6 to 7 steps that I use to anticipate practically all of my opponents. It's an excellent strategy if you know your stuff in a game and are good at reading people. To me, this is how Grand Arena should ideally be played, but I realize that it's not for everyone because of the time commitments, etc. Now, the nice part is that the more you use this strategy, the better you get at it. After a while, you'll have a bunch of pre-made maps and only need to look out for specific teams and characters to find which map qualifies best for a specific opponent. Are you one of the dedicated players that adapts to each opponent? Let me know in the comments below. The next strategy is all about ensuring that your opponent cannot full clear you, while you clear them as efficiently as you're able to, which sometimes means multi-shotting teams. I hope to see you there.